a short video about this book, Demystifying the Chinese Economy by Yifu. This book puts the periods from 1949 until around 2008. The book came out roughly 2009. With regards to China and the Chinese economy under the microscope. So it looks in quite considerable detail at what happened when the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, took power in 1949 under Chairman Mao, who was the leader of China from 1949 until his death in around 1976. Looks at the 5-year plans that he implemented and really some of the adverse consequences of those policies, including the famine of the late 1950s, which came about as a result of some of the things that he implemented in the Great Leap Forward. Then it also looks at the reforms that Deng Xiaoping implemented in 1978. So in 1978, under Deng Xiaoping, who interestingly was actually kicked out of the CCP by Chairman Mao because Chairman Mao thought that he was against and he was somewhat of an opponent because he didn't agree with all that the previous administration were doing with regards to their strict and rigid communist policies. So he was sent away, I think to a labour camp actually. You'll need to check the history of Deng Xiaoping. His life is quite an interesting story just by itself, and you can watch documentaries on YouTube about his life. He was with Chairman Mao Zedong from the very start, including on the Great March. So in the 1930s, there was a power struggle, there was a battle between two parties. The KMT, that was led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Communist Party, led by Mao. Broadly speaking, the KMT were on the side of landlords and of the business class and of the owners of businesses and property, whereas the communists, who gained a lot of support in the more rural areas. Remember, at this time, the vast majority of people lived in rural areas in China, or on farms. And the Chinese Communist Party got a lot of support because one of the things that they promised was that the land would be given to the peasants. It would be taken from the landlords and given to peasants. Again, going back to the Marxist creed of exploiters and the exploited, that very much fits in with that way of thinking. They saw the landlords as being sort of exploitative, and so Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party became very popular because they were promising that they would overthrow the landlords and give more power to the peasantry and the workers in China. They were also, so much of history is quite accidental as well. There's an interesting story of how, so in the late 19th century, I think in 1894, there was a war between Japan and China. And there were a series of wars from that point onwards, and those wars were incredibly brutal. People in the UK, in the United States, we of course tend to focus on the First World War and the horrors of the First World War and the Second World War. But over in China, that was the biggest concern for the Chinese government and the people who were in charge. And by the way, it wasn't clear. So prior to 1949, China was in a state really of civil war. There were lots of warlords who controlled various regions in various parts of China, and they were constantly battling and vying for power. But the two main parties, the KMT and the Communist Party, the KMT were in power, but the Japanese invaded China in the First World War and were quite successful. Japan had industrialized in the late 19th century, and so at this time they were more advanced with their weaponry, with their technology, you know, with their air force, for example. They flew over cities and just bombed. And some of the horrors of the Chinese-Japanese war, incredible violence, incredible brutality. So in reading this book, what you might find yourself doing, and what probably is worth doing, is just researching online, because the author talks about many things which, if you didn't know about, or you didn't study at school, and in school we never really looked at China, you'll need to find out what exactly was that, where is that, because he talks about places in China, and most people don't have a map of China in their head. They don't know where the main provinces are. And so the book is useful and interesting because it will give you reference points to research and to further try to understand what's going on in the periods that he's talking about. But the war between China and Japan weakened the KMT, and the Communist Party were able to take over in 1948. It was either 1948 or 1949, and this was the time when the PRC, the People's Republic of China, came into being. So the CCP modelled much of their economic policies, their way of thinking, on the USSR. So they were allied with the USSR. Obviously, the USSR had a revolution in 1918. The Bolsheviks came to power in the USSR. Stalin was in charge. And what they were doing in terms of industrializing, China copied many of those policies. So this is what happens from 1948 in the first 5-year plan, and the author talks about some of the difficulties they had, because at this time China, very, very poor country. It was one of the poorest countries in the world, and so people just didn't have the knowledge, didn't have the expertise. And what China had to do was it set up 4 banks in order to supply capital to key industries. And of course, because of the recent history with the Japanese wars, the wars between China and Japan, which were absolutely brutal, so many millions of people dead. And of course, that coming on the back of the century of humiliation. So China called the period from roughly 1830 to the end of the Second World War the century of humiliation, because the colonial powers, Britain, France, Germany, Holland, the United States, Britain first, in the First Opium War, embarrassed China really, because they went to China and they were much more advanced as a result of the industrialization which occurred in Europe first. He does also talk about why the European powers industrialized first. So Britain was the first in the late 18th century, and he offers some reasons why there was a great divergence, why Europe industrialized and China didn't, because that really was the cause of the great humiliation, the century of humiliation, because the Royal Navy, the ships the British had, they just went there and they were able to completely blow out the water, you know, what the Chinese army had. And so, coming on the back of this, one of the things that Mao Zedong would have been conscious very much was he wanted armaments. So he wanted heavy industry because, of course, having been involved in all of these conflicts, also the war, there was a civil war between the KMT and the CCP. So I was saying, I didn't quite finish the point I was making, that the CCP, they went on a long march and they travelled something like 10,000 miles across China because they essentially were on the run. The KMT had kicked them out of, I can't remember which city it was, but they had to leave the city, and they marched through the villages and they settled in a particular place which they made their base. And then the nature of the Chinese-Japanese War meant that from that base they were able to eventually take power. So it's quite an interesting story. That march that the leaders of the CCP, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, only about 20% of the people actually survived that march, because it was over quite harsh terrain through the Chinese mountains on the western side, and there were battles taking place between the KMT, the allies of the KMT, because at this time China wasn't really unified. There were lots of factions and groups and allegiances, and it was quite a chaotic period. The Chinese Communist Party take power in 1949, and then you have the 5-year plans, and he talks about comparative advantage defying policies. In other words, he, the author of this book, says one of the reasons why communism failed was because it didn't really make use of what China's main advantages are, and their main advantage really is their huge labour supply. China is one of the most populated countries throughout history, and today I think India and China are quite similar. So he looks at some of the issues that took place in the 1950s. Then there was the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s. And what happened there was they decided to collectivise the lands. So what that meant was that they abolished private property, because this is a very communist party. So private property was seen as kind of selfish, and ownership of money even. They didn't even have money. So the agricultural reform that the CCP put in place in the 1950s, people had to work on the land, and that the produce of their work, the things that produced on the farm, the vegetables, the rice, that was all given to communes, and they would all eat together, because that was the rule of the party, that you would work, and then you would give that, what you're growing on the farm, to the commune, and everyone would eat together. But according to the author, what that did was that it disincentivized people from actually working on the farm, because there was no individual incentive. If they were working to put food on the table, increasingly, he talks about game theory a little bit. Increasingly, people just said, well, okay, well, I'll just, take what people have produced, and I won't, produce for myself. And so there was also, so people disagree on how much of what's happened with the Great Famine. I think there's an estimate around 35 million people died, so it was a dramatic event. and people disagree with the causes and how much of an impact each cause had. But the collectivisation of land, because people couldn't sell any surplus because they weren't allowed money, they had a credit-based system where you could take out essentially what you put in. So the more you put in, you can get more out. But according to the author, the people lacked motivation to work. And similarly across the economy, because there isn't any profit motive, people just didn't really work very hard. What Deng Xiaoping does in 1978, and really this is what causes the great explosion in their economy, incredible change in just 40 years. And as I said earlier, just take a look at pictures of China in the 1970s. Take a look at the same cities in the 1960s and 1970s that you can see today. Ultra modern, tall skyscrapers, modern cars, modern transportation systems, railroads. None of that really was there in the 1960s and 1970s, a really recent thing. But what Deng Xiaoping did in 1978 was that he introduced more capitalist, market-based economic policies. So he introduced agricultural reform, which meant that people could sell surplus on the market. So that farmers now, whatever they made, in addition to what they needed themselves to eat, they could sell on the market across the country. So he also operated a market across the country, which worked because that is in harmony with comparative advantage. Some parts of China much better for growing rice. I think the south is much better for agriculture because there's more rainfall, and so they can produce a surplus and they can sell it to other regions of China, make money, and then with that money people would save it or they could invest it, and with that surplus that increases the total amount of capital China as a whole has, and this means that it can invest in technological upgrades, technological improvement. Does talk about how in China what they tended to do from the 1978, because they were really catching up to Japan and Western European countries. They were kind of taking technology because they could now afford it, because with a surplus, which came about as a result of incentivizing people to produce more because they could sell it, make money and buy things, this quite rapidly meant that farmers could now invest in machines and invest in fertilizer and things which are going to rapidly improve farming outputs. With more food, more money, they can buy new technology, the process becomes even more efficient, much more productive, and you create a virtuous cycle. In addition to this, what Deng Xiaoping also did was he opened China up. So prior to 1978, it was a very insular, very inward-looking country that didn't really trade with the world. But Deng Xiaoping, who famously said, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, what matters is, does it catch mice? In other words, he was very pragmatic-minded, and he opened China up to trade. And so what you have from 1978 is factories springing up in cities in China where people, and again this plays into the comparative advantage because you have a huge amount of labour. So with a huge amount of labour, obviously the salaries are going to be quite cheap, quite low. compared to Western Europe, because lots of labour, it means there's competition among labour for jobs, employers can pay low wages, which is why so much of what we have around us comes from China, because the products are much cheaper, because the salaries are lower. Although they have improved quite greatly. China is, I think, the largest country in the world in terms of GDP, but it still has a GDP per capita, which is, you take the entire output of the country, the entire wealth of the country, in effect, and divide it by the population, and the GDP per capita, that is the average wealth, or the wealth of the average individual in China, is less than half of people in the UK. I think it's around a third, actually. It's about a third of what it is in the UK, and about a quarter of what it is in the US. One of the things he talks about at the end of the book is some of the challenges going forward, and he does say that one of the challenges is to address the inequality that has grown since 1978 as a result of businessmen becoming very wealthy on the back of, or on the backs of Chinese labour. But essentially, one of the things that clearly stands out with China is the increase in exports. They're the biggest exporters in the world, and they're accumulating huge amounts of capital, which is why they came out of the 2008-2009 financial crisis relatively unscathed. Didn't seem to have too much of an impact on their economy, because they have vast amounts of capital which they can invest in Chinese companies and in technology. The other thing, which of course happened in 1978 when those reforms were initiated, foreign investment flooded in as well. And today China is the country which has the second largest amount of foreign investment. That's American people, British people, French people, people from all around the world investing in Chinese companies. And of course, that huge influx of capital and investment means that they can have the latest high-tech technology, and of course research their own technology, and be less dependent on sort of importing technology from Western Europe and from the United States. So it's a very interesting book. I think I've given you a sort of overview of it, a kind of scattergun overview of the book. But I would say it's very much worth learning more about China, because it's a very important country in the world today, and will be for many decades. And people forget as well, China, looking over a very long period of time, is regarded as one of the great powers. Relatively speaking, prior to the Industrial Revolution, China had enjoyed, relatively, we're talking about, everyone was poor prior to the Industrial Revolution, but relatively China was one of the most prosperous parts of the world. And of course their culture goes back thousands of years. China's considered one of the oldest civilizations, where civilization emerged along the banks of the Yangtze River. So it's a very old civilization. Last point I'll just make is that the author attributes the cause of the Great Divergence in the late 18th century as being due to sort of an overemphasis on Confucianism. Confucius was a philosopher who wrote about, he offered a guide to morality and ethics, essentially, and things he advocates are sort of a reverence or a respect, or almost an obedience to authority, that people should respect their elders and their parents, and also the state, and that's how people should think of themselves, as respecting their ancestors. And of course it promotes hard work as well. But the reason why he suggests China stagnated, not only for the other reasons that people perhaps would give. So for example, many people would say, if you ask them why did China not industrialize in the late 18th century, whereas Britain, Holland, France, Germany did. One of the reasons some people would say is that, well, Western Europe is broken up into lots of mini countries and they're all competing. So the British were in competition with the French on the Atlantic, and this motivates, constant improvement because they don't want to be embarrassed on the sea. They want to constantly improve, their technology. And that competition kind of motivates constant betterment, constant improvement. Whereas China being so huge and being so diverse, that sort of internal competitive aspect wasn't there. That's one suggestion that people have, it's one reason people think caused or partially caused the Great Divergence. But he seems to suggest that it was perhaps partly a consequence of the strong and rigid belief in Confucianism. For example, one of the highest jobs in the land was to be a member of the civil service, and in order to be a member of the civil service you had to pass a test, and that test required people to be able to recite and answer questions about, I think it's called the 5 Classics and the 6 Texts. These are books about Confucianism, and people spending so much time on Confucianist philosophy didn't invest the time to learn mathematics and science. This is one of the things he puts forward, because he says that the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe was preceded by the Scientific Revolution, in which maths and science and experiments, controlled experiments, really comes to the fore and is the cause of the technological advantage that particularly Britain, but other European countries enjoyed, and the United States towards the latter part of the 19th century, which led them to increasingly become, the most technologically advanced and affluent parts of the world. But all of this you can learn about in this book, so I think this is a great starting point. It is quite technical. I would say it's kind of sort of an intermediate or difficult book to read. Some of the words he uses, if you're not an economist, you'll need to research them. I didn't read it twice, I read it once, but I had to go over the previous chapters and just revisit them because I had to find out what exactly he's talking about. So it is a good book, a really good book to get your teeth into. And I think it would be worth to read it, supplementing what he's saying with watching videos, watching documentaries on YouTube about some of the things that happened in the 20th century in China. The other reason why I think it's worth learning about China is we can gain a much better understanding of our own economy, because sometimes when you look at your own country, it's sometimes hard to see the wood through the trees. You can't see where improvements can be made because you're so familiar with the landscape. If you look at another country that was in a completely different stage of development in the 1970s, you look at, okay, well, how did they get so rich? That can offer some fresh insights into how economic policies can be tailored towards incentivizing individuals to be more productive, more creative, and really how we can ensure that technology, because that's really the sharp end, that's the frontier of economic development. That really is, the spearhead, if you will, of how countries improve is through their technological improvements. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Do check it out. You can also watch him and listen to him talk on YouTube. He's given a number of talks. He is a renowned economist. I think he was deputy chief of the world. Oh, I can't remember now. Let me see. He held chief economist of the World Bank. So senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank. Okay. Obtained a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago in 1986 and returned to China in 1987. So it's a guy who really knows what he's talking about. He's studied this for many decades, and you can learn an awful lot from him. So I'll leave that with you. Thank you for watching.